Okay. So, here we go. We are going over the video for the reasons for why the U.S. expanded. So buckle your seatbelts, here we go. What you're looking at here is a map of the United States after basically its involvement in the Western Hemisphere after 1924. And what you're going to notice is different colors, different things. There's the United States, there's the U.S. possession, which means the U.S. owns it. The U.S., it's a territory of the United States and has to work within the U.S. Government and is controlled by the U.S. government. Protectorates are places where the United States basically has final say on a lot of their political decisions, a lot of their foreign policy, but they rule themselves within. Usually a protectorate means the United States has a large portion of the trade and that they are used for U.S. gain. So, political reasons for why we went across. And so what we're going to do is we're going to look at 4 different reasons. And I've combined ideological with social because I find that those two kind of flow together. So the first one we're going to hit is political reasons. Political reasons for why the U.S. wanted to expand. Now, we just assume that the U.S. wanted to expand. There was a debate on whether the United States should become imperial, take over possessions or not, but there wasn't really a debate on that the U.S. should spread its influence across the globe. We have to understand Americans at this time. Americans believed that they had something special. They had a special government. They had the great inventors and the progress and the Industrial Revolution, and they felt like they were the creme de la creme of societies. And they wanted to take that, what they considered the American gospel of progress, and spread that across the globe. And they thought most people would want to see that. So Latin America is the U.S. sphere of influence. It starts really early with John Adams. Even Thomas Jefferson, after the Louisiana Purchase, looked into acquiring Cuba. The Monroe Doctrine, which we will talk about over the next couple of days, stated that the U.S. would not interfere with the new nations. Cuba, or Latin America became independent in 1823, and the U.S. said, we're not going to involve ourselves with them. And they also said, Europe, you need to stay out. Then you have the Ostend, so the United States basically setting up that they are the preeminent power in the Western Hemisphere. Then you have the Ostend Manifesto, which really has a lot to do with slavery and the Civil War. But again, a way to solve slavery was to acquire Cuba or take Cuba from Spain. Let Spain know we'll take it if you don't sell it to us. And then Cuba, which already had slavery, could be a slave state. And so basically it shows that the United States have been looking at Cuba and then a lot of Latin America for a long time. And looking at it, that is the place where the U.S. should expand. In the 1880s and in the 1890s, William G. Blaine rose to prominence. He became the Secretary of State. And he believed that the U.S. should get beyond this idea of imperialism, where you take over another nation. He believed that the United States should not take over territory, but annex the trade of that territory, meaning that the U.S. should encourage business people to invest. They should encourage U.S. banks to lend, build railroads, build the ports, build the plantations, build progress and take progress to the nations of Latin America and other places. And then through that influence, be able to control that country, be able to, because if you control the trade of that country, you have a lot of influence over its government. And so the United States would extend its influence over the Western Hemisphere through a commercial empire, through trading, through investment, through moving forward with this. And you can see in 2 ways, both that the U.S. investment in Latin America goes from around the hundreds of thousands in 1868 to over $1.5 million invested by the end of the Spanish-American War. And so we see that the United States is investing a lot. World trade and the trade that's going into the United States expands during this period and grows tremendously, showing that the United States that economics is part of this, but was it Blaine's commercial empire, his idea of annexing trade rather than territory, that pushed this forward? Republicans versus Democrats. This was the debate over whether the United States should take over countries. Hawaii was first settled by American missionaries, and then the sons and daughters of those missionaries began to build plantations and fruit plantations. And so a lot of U.S. business people owned a lot of property in Hawaii, and they were producing goods. Well, in 1893, there was a tariff put on Hawaii. And so when that happened, the planters took over Hawaii, and they wanted Cleveland to annex them so that they wouldn't have to pay a tax to import their stuff to the United States if they were part of the U.S. And so they asked for annexation. Cleveland believed it was against American values to take over another country. However, later on, McKinley, during the Spanish-American War, supported by big business, annexes Hawaii. And you can see that this debate was a political debate of, are we sacrificing American values by going abroad? All right, so that's the political reasons. And we can see that all of these things kind of had an influence. What I really want you to think of is, as we go over these three phases, which one do you think is the biggest deal? All right, Industrial Revolution. This is a term that's used for two different periods of history, but after the Civil War, there was a large amount of capital that was built up. People had made a lot of money off the war, and so they had all this money, and capital is the leftover money that you have after meeting your needs as a business or as a person. You have capital. You have extra money to spend. And so U.S. business people were wanting to reinvest that money. And so they reinvested the money using new inventions and using the natural resource of the United States. A booming industry came out of the U.S. And this booming industry pushed the U.S. abroad. But in addition, the United States has always been a leading producer within agriculture, and the Industrial Revolution and some new inventions allowed the U.S. to even take its agricultural ideas further. We know early on that one of the ways that the U.S. had a huge influence over others was they would send agricultural missions to other countries to teach them the way that the United States is able to raise and produce so many crops and so many livestock and that type of thing. Part of that is government support in technological sophistication and specialization. The government supported or passed the Morrill Act in 1862. And what this did, this is obviously not part of our 1880 time period, but what this act did was promoted scientific advances in irrigation, farm mechanization, crop management, seed variety, and food processing. So it helped with all of these different ideas and ways of doing things, and then overcame the water and seed problems of the plains, basically by creating irrigation, by creating seeds that would resist common diseases and those types of things, that they became the breadbasket of the world. And so the Great Plains grew. And so the United States was making way more in agricultural production than it could basically. Let's talk about the agriculture and manufactured goods right here. Basically, in 1900, the U.S. exported 2/3 of both the cotton and wheat crops to other countries. And so they were producing so much cotton and wheat that they were sending over 2/3 to other countries. And basically, the United States had been sending different agricultural products throughout the world at times when the other people needed it because of famine or other things, but just because they were setting up markets and producing agricultural goods. Now, manufactured goods, though, become more than 50% of U.S. exports, meaning stuff that the U.S. sends to other countries in 1914. And they basically, in 1914, supplant Britain as the preeminent manufacturing country in the world. And this is one of the reasons people say that the United States, this is one of the results of expansion, but also a need for expansion. To go back to a little bit to Taylorism and mass production, this is part of the idea of the Industrial Revolution, that Taylorism is to take the scientific approach and make a worker totally 100% productive. He would take a stopwatch and somebody shoveling coal into a furnace and find that person's exactly what they should be doing. He helped kind of bring about this idea of mass production, of the assembly line. Remington sewing machine was one of the first mass-produced items, and this thing went across the world because of electricity. The Remington sewing machine was exported everywhere, and people began to produce clothing at a high rate, and were able to produce a lot more clothing. And then the U.S. also sold a lot of its clothing abroad. And so basically these new inventions, mass-produced inventions, were sent across the world and kind of pushed the U.S. Into other countries. Once you get involved with somebody money-wise, then you automatically become involved with them in every other way. If you lend somebody $100, you are now somewhat invested in that person's future because you want them to be able to pay that $100 back. If you would lend somebody $100,000, you are now totally invested and want them to succeed. But you also are going to be involved with them because you want your $100,000 back. And so the idea here is that the United States, by investing, by opening markets, by selling, is putting themselves where they now care about what's happening in the rest of the world. A search for land and markets. Basically, the end of the railroad meant that the U.S. need for work and a market for a large amount of steel being produced. And so the United States, basically, at the urging of Blaine, at the urging of other U.S. and business leaders, James Hill, who led one of the largest train companies in the United States, they start going down to Panama, going to Cuba, going to these places and building railroads and kind of creating a more modern and bringing progress to these other countries. And the question is, were they doing that so that they could make money off these countries who were producing one or two crops that then would be sold in the U.S. market? Or were they doing that because they honestly believed that they were helping that country? And although most of us cynically will say, you know, they were doing this because they were making money, yes, of course they were. But did they believe an overarching idea that they could bring progress and help other people and uplift them? Panics in 1873 and 1893. The main panic we need to talk about is 1893. In 1893, the U.S. Economy was growing, booming before 1993. And basically what happens, and we know this in capitalist countries, is that in a capitalist economic system, is that there are dips. There are times where people stop producing, they lay off workers, then other businesses go out of business, and basically the strong survives and the economy recovers. Well, in 1893 was a 4-year depression, and it was considered the Great Depression until 1929 came along. And so people began to get nervous. Now, we all know that you've all had a test at one point in time, or you believe that there was a test in a class, and you believe that test was there, and so you studied for it, you panicked about it, you were all over it, you really tried to make it happen, and yet there was no test. But for you, it was real, and that's what the Depression in 1893, it became real that the reason the U.S. went into the Depression, although most economists would not agree with this, but people believed that they went into the Depression because there was overproduction of goods. There was too many goods being produced for the U.S. market. And so there was a lot of reasons for and pushing people to go to other markets, to go and sell goods, to reach out to other countries and sell this overproduction. And then we have private business. These interests led the way. And this is the idea that private businesses were going out and leading a lot of this expansion. And then the U.S. government basically had to catch up and support these different businesses. Standard Oil in 1890 began to invest in Bolivia and Mexico and Venezuela, where large amounts of oil were being found. They would go in and start exporting that oil. And exported American oil to the United States. They refined oil, and then they sent it across. And they wielded immense power in these countries because the oil was one of their greatest natural resources, and Standard Oil had the technology to pull it out of the ground. Then you have United Fruit Company, which was formed in 1899, and this was a combination of fruit companies and railroads and shipping to put together this massive multinational company that began to operate throughout Central America. And in some places, United Fruit had more power in those countries than the country itself. Investment overseas. Jobs sent overseas. In order to get around tariff walls and to avoid shipping costs, U.S. companies set up factories on foreign soil. The Grace Company started to invest sugar after given plantations as debt payments. Drug companies set up companies established plants to abroad to avoid U.S. laws. Well, this sounds like today, but this was in the late 1800s, early 1900s. These ventures were pushed abroad and forced the U.S. to deal with the problem that comes with foreign investment. Forced to deal with the problem of how to then get involved in these other countries. We need to talk about a few people here as we move into the socially ideological, and this is really an idea. Alfred T. Mahan wrote the most influential book in naval history called The Influence of Sea Power Upon History. And here he is. Alfred T. Mahan becomes an admiral. First was a captain, and basically he was a captain who got seasick. He was a Navy man who didn't like to be on boats. But what he developed was a talent. He was a great historian, and so he began to teach at the Naval Academy. And he wrote this book as he was studying different naval wars and different naval powers. And basically he came to the United States with some ideas, some strong ideas. Let's get rid of his picture here. Okay, so let me get in here. We're going to delete that for now. We're going to come up here. Here we go. So a key to building an economic empire begins with naval power. He believed that in order for the United States to be an economic power, it had to be a naval power. Mahan said that oceans are not barriers, but a great highway where man passes in all directions, or men pass in all directions. And so we know that from Alfred T. Mahan that the ocean is no longer a barrier and a cushion away from other countries, that if the United States is really going to be a power, it must have a strong navy and a presence worldwide. And so Mahan was one of the voices saying we need to grow, we need to spread, we need to go into these other countries, we need to create coaling stations. One of the reasons for annexing Hawaii, for places in the Caribbean, taking islands outside of Mexico, and then moving into Asia and different places was to have coaling stations throughout the world so that the U.S. Navy could go anywhere it pleases. And Theodore Roosevelt was also a major supporter of this, and that's why when Theodore Roosevelt was president, 16 different U.S. battleships took a tour around the nation. That naval power that Roosevelt and Mahan pushed the United States to become one of the preeminent navies in the world. All right, here's another big idea or event that happened. This is the World's Fair in Chicago in 1896. And so one of the things that happens at this World Fair is that you have people that come and bring new ideas. Actually, the fair was in 1893, sorry. And one of the themes here is the Americanization of the world. That people in America believed, and when they traveled abroad, they would look and say, this isn't as great as America. And they would travel and say, these people need the influence of America. And so you see all these inventions being sold or shown at this World's Fair, and you begin to see and people saying that the United States wants to Americanize the rest of the world. Part of this, a guy by the name of Frederick Jackson Turner, who actually is one of our thinkers for history, presented the frontier thesis. And when he presented the frontier thesis, what it is was a speech, a document where he went in and looked at the 1890 census. And the census is just a document that tells us how many people there are, where they live, what jobs they're doing, and all those types of things. And for the first time in U.S. history, there was no frontier. Before in census, they would say there's this many people doing this, and then there's the frontier, and we estimate that there's this many people. Because there was no roads, no transportation, no communication networks, and they couldn't get out there. Well, by 1890, everything is owned by somebody, and there's no more free land, there's no more frontier. And Frederick Jackson Turner believed that the frontier was the reason we had America. That America came from the frontier, the access to free land. And once we lose that free land, so will America lose its identity. And so America needs to go and expand. And he was saying this at this World's Fair. We need to expand, and we need to go to other countries, and we need to build ourselves up. At the same one, Roosevelt gives a large speech about the greatness of America. And so we start to see this idea at this World's Fair that the United States believes it's great and can go abroad. All right, I know it's getting late. I know we're at 20 minutes here, but there's a couple more ideas we have to get across. and then we'll be done. So we've got the World's Fair. We've got Alfred T. Mahan and his belief on the influence of sea power. Okay? Now we've got this cartoon. You're going to see it again in class, but I want you to pay attention. There's an idea called the white man's burden. It was coined by a British poet and author, and he basically said, welcome the United States to the Imperial Club. The United States, with its spreading, especially after the Spanish-American War, where they took over territories, the United States begins to annex other places and have protectorates. And so the United States is getting up into this idea of the white man's burden. That because the white man is a superior race, and this is the belief that a lot of people had in Europe and the United States, that because the U.S. is this superior race, and basically Roosevelt was really influenced by this idea of Anglo-Saxons, and a lot of people in the United States, this Anglo-Saxon dominance. A preacher by the name of Josiah Strong wrote about this and talked about it. And this idea that the white English-speaking people were the greatest race in the world, and because they were so great, that their job was to go out and lift all these other people. McKinley, after the Spanish-American War, said that we need to help our little brown brothers in the Philippines. And basically this idea was that, that the Americans and the leaders believed that they were superior to these other races, and it was their job to go and bring progress and invention. And this cartoon basically makes fun of that. That because it's not the white man who's carrying the others, but you can see that it's the Indian carrying the British and the Cuban carrying Uncle Sam. And all of these different empires are being carried by minorities. There's one other big social idea that we need to talk about, and that is the idea of social Darwinism. We talked a little bit about this today in different classes when Darwin is one of our thinkers, but he basically applies, and people applied, his survival of the fittest to nations, saying that the nations that were the richest and rise to power and the most dominant was because that they were naturally that way, and it happened to be a lot of the white races. And so you see that the whites then begin to look at themselves and say, we are the fittest, we are the best, we should use the land, we should use their land, and them as the workers to create a better world because we are the fittest. And it explains the world situation in a way that they want it explained, which puts them on top. And so social Darwinism is an influential idea within the United States, that they believed that they could spread to other countries and take advantage of other countries and get rich off other countries because they were superior to them. And this goes into another idea of American exceptionalism. Seen through the writings of the time, Theodore Roosevelt, Henry Cabot Lodge, and other imperialists, that the United States was the greatest nation. And because it was the greatest nation, and because it was this great democracy of freedom and progress, that it then is exceptional to all other nations, including Europe. And so therefore, the United States needs to go and take its ideas. You see this not just politically or economically or even with these ideologies, but missionaries and social welfare groups went throughout the world. And popular culture begins to spread throughout the world. Wild Bill and the Old West show goes through Europe. And you see the U.S. basically with this idea of the phrase coined, trying to Americanize the world. So there it is. These are some of the reasons why the United States goes and these are some of the reasons for why the U.S. had expansionist foreign policies. So please bring your notes to class. Good job. And I want you to see, do you see any themes? Do you see any ideas here? And then we will spend some time on Thursday going through some activities so that you will understand this better.